The morning sun filtered through the tall windows of the county courthouse as Dr. Eleanor Wright made her way through the security checkpoint. At 68 years old, she moved with the quiet dignity that came from decades of standing in front of lecture halls and courtrooms. Today, however, she wasn't here to teach or argue a case. She was here for a simple parking ticket. Next on the docket, called the clerk, his voice echoing through the wood-paneled courtroom. Case number 47,293, City versus Wright, parking violation. Eleanor straightened her simple gray blazer and approached the defendant's table. She carried only a small folder of documents and her reading glasses. Unlike many others in the room that day, she hadn't bothered to bring an attorney. After teaching law for 35 years at Georgetown University, she felt more than capable of handling a routine traffic matter. Judge Richard Harmon barely looked up from his papers. At 52, he had developed a reputation in the county for his strict interpretations of the law and his impatience with those who appeared before him. The bailiff called the court to order, and the judge finally raised his eyes to see who stood before him. Mrs. Wright, you're charged with illegal parking in a loading zone on March 2nd. How do you plead? His voice carried the bored tone of someone who had heard every excuse imaginable. Your Honor, I would like to plead not guilty, Eleanor replied calmly, her voice clear despite her age. And it's Dr. Wright, if you please. The judge's eyebrows rose slightly at the correction, but he continued without acknowledging it. On what grounds do you contest this ticket, Mrs. Wright? He asked, emphasizing the Mrs. with a slight edge to his voice. Eleanor noticed the deliberate slight, but chose to focus on the facts. The signage at the location was obscured by construction materials, Your Honor. I have photographs showing that the sign was not visible from where I parked. She reached into her folder to retrieve the evidence. Judge Harmon waved his hand dismissively. The responsibility to find and obey signs falls on the driver, not the city. Your failure to locate the sign doesn't invalidate the violation. With respect, Your Honor, Eleanor continued, her voice gaining the measured cadence she used when explaining complex legal concepts to first-year students. Precedent established in Wilson v. Municipal Authority clearly states that obscured signage constitutes inadequate notice to motorists. The judge's face darkened. Are you attempting to lecture me on the law, Mrs. Wright? Several people in the gallery shifted uncomfortably in their seats. The court clerk looked up from his computer, sensing the change in the judge's tone. I'm simply stating relevant case law, Your Honor, Eleanor replied, maintaining her composure. She had faced far more intimidating opponents than an irritated traffic court judge. Judge Harmon slammed his gavel down suddenly, making several people jump. I find your tone disrespectful to this court. I've heard enough of your amateur legal opinions. Eleanor blinked in surprise but stood her ground. Your Honor, I believe I have the right to present a complete defense. That's enough, the judge interrupted, his face now flushed with anger. I find you in contempt of court and fine you $10,000 for wasting this court's time with pseudo-legal arguments and disrespect for judicial authority. A gasp ran through the courtroom. Even the prosecutor looked shocked at the excessive penalty for such a minor exchange. Eleanor stood perfectly still, her face betraying only the slightest hint of surprise at the judge's outburst. She had witnessed judicial overreach before, but rarely had she seen it directed at her with such obvious disdain. Little did Judge Harmon know that the elderly black woman he had just fined was about to change the course of his career forever. A tense silence filled the courtroom after Judge Harmon's shocking announcement. The court clerk stopped typing, his fingers frozen above the keyboard. The bailiff shifted uncomfortably, looking between the judge and Dr. Wright. Your Honor, Eleanor said quietly, I believe that fine is excessive for contempt in a simple traffic case. Judge Harmon leaned forward, his hands clasped tightly on the bench. Maybe this will teach you to respect the authority of this court. You can't walk in here and start citing cases as if you know better than the judge. From the back of the courtroom, a young man in a well-fitted suit stood up. Marcus Jenkins, a first-year clerk for the district court, recognized Dr. Wright immediately. He had just completed his second year at Georgetown Law when Dr. Wright had given a guest lecture that changed the direction of his career. He whispered urgently to the bailiff, who looked surprised before approaching the bench. Meanwhile, Eleanor calmly opened her wallet and placed her faculty ID card on the table. I would like to request a moment to call my department chair, as I may need to miss my afternoon lecture due to these unexpected proceedings. The bailiff reached Judge Harmon and leaned down to whisper in his ear. The judge's expression remained unchanged at first, and his eyebrows rose slightly. He looked down at Eleanor with new interest. "Mrs. Wright," he said, his tone suddenly less certain, "what exactly is your profession?" Eleanor looked directly at the judge, her voice level and clear. "I am a tenured professor of constitutional and civil rights law at Georgetown University Law Center, where I've taught for 35 years. Before that, I served as clerk to Justice Marshall at the Supreme Court, and I currently chair the Judicial Ethics Committee for the American Bar Association." A murmur spread through the courtroom. Several attorneys waiting for their cases to be called exchanged glances and whispers. One of them, a middle-aged woman, covered her mouth to hide a smile. Judge Harmon's face went through a remarkable transformation. The redness of anger drained away, replaced by a growing paleness. He cleared his throat and shuffled papers on his desk, suddenly interested in organizing his calendar. "I see," he said finally, "and you were citing Wilson v. Municipal Authority." "Yes, Your Honor," Eleanor replied. "The 2011 case established that municipalities must maintain clearly visible signage for parking regulations to be enforceable. I have photographs showing that construction materials completely obscured the loading zone sign on the day in question." The prosecutor, sensing the shift in the courtroom, stood up. "Your Honor, in light of this information, the city may want to review the evidence more thoroughly before proceeding." Judge Harmon nodded quickly, seemingly relieved at the opportunity to step back. "That seems reasonable. Dr. Wright, perhaps we should reschedule this hearing to allow the city to review your evidence." Eleanor smiled politely, but firmly shook her head. "With respect, Your Honor, I've already taken time away from my classes today. I'd prefer to resolve this now, if possible. And I'd also like to address the contempt fine, which remains on the record." The judge shifted uncomfortably in his seat. In the gallery, more people were paying attention now. A court reporter from the local paper, who had come for a different case, had opened her notebook and was writing rapidly. "Of course," Judge Harmon said, his voice now almost friendly. "Let's see those photographs of yours." Eleanor handed over the clearly labeled photos showing the construction scaffolding completely covering the parking sign. As the judge examined them, she stood calmly, aware that everyone in the courtroom was watching the interaction with great interest. She had faced discrimination many times in her long career, the assumptions, the dismissals, the condescension. But after decades in law, she knew exactly how to stand her ground. And the look on Judge Harmon's face told her that the real education in this courtroom was only just beginning. Judge Harmon studied the photographs with exaggerated interest, taking much longer than necessary. The entire courtroom waited in expectant silence. He was clearly buying time, trying to figure out how to extract himself from the situation he had created. "These photos do appear to show obstruction of the sign," he finally admitted, looking up. His voice had lost its earlier harshness. "However, the law requires due diligence from drivers to locate and follow parking regulations." Eleanor nodded patiently. "I understand that perspective, Your Honor. May I direct your attention to the third photo? It shows the view from the driver's seat of my car. As you can see, the construction tarp completely covers where the sign would be visible from the street." A young attorney in the gallery raised her hand slightly, catching the judge's eye. "Your Honor, if I may? I'm Sarah Chen, a former student of Dr. Wright's. The precedent she cited established a reasonable person standard for visibility of parking signs. These photos clearly meet that threshold." Judge Harmon frowned at the unexpected intervention, but couldn't deny the growing support for Eleanor in his courtroom. Several other attorneys nodded in agreement. "The court appreciates the input, Counselor," he said stiffly, "but I don't recall asking for it." Eleanor watched the judge's discomfort grow and decided to offer him a way out. "Your Honor, perhaps we could address both matters at once. The parking violation and the contempt charge?" The judge looked relieved at this suggestion. "Yes, that seems prudent." Eleanor continued, her voice taking on the measured tone she used when presenting important legal principles to her students. "In the interest of judicial economy, I'd like to note that Wilson v. Municipal Authority isn't the only relevant case here. In Johnson v. City of Portland, The court held that a contempt fine must be proportional to the alleged offense. The court clerk, unable to hide his interest in the proceedings, had stopped typing to watch. The bailiff stood straighter, sensing that something unusual was happening in their typically routine traffic court. $10,000 for a first-time contempt charge in traffic court exceeds any reasonable standard of proportionality, Eleanor continued. As established in Thompson v. Judicial Board, such a fine could be considered an abuse of judicial discretion. Judge Harmon's face tightened. He understood now that Dr. Wright wasn't just knowledgeable. She was laying groundwork for a potential complaint to the Judicial Ethics Committee, the same committee she chaired. Dr. Wright, he said, forcing a more respectful tone, the court recognizes your expertise in these matters. In light of the photographic evidence and the circumstances, I'm inclined to dismiss the parking violation. Eleanor smiled politely. Thank you, Your Honor. And the contempt charge? The judge shuffled some papers, avoiding eye contact. In reviewing the exchange, I believe the contempt citation was hastily issued. The court withdraws the charge and the associated fine. A quiet murmur of approval spread through the courtroom. The court reporter scribbled furiously in her notebook. Thank you, Your Honor, Eleanor said. I appreciate the court's reconsideration. Just as the matter seemed resolved, the doors at the back of the courtroom opened. A tall, distinguished man in his 70s entered and took a seat in the gallery. Several attorneys immediately recognized Dean Robert Mitchell of Georgetown Law School. Word had somehow reached the law school about what was happening. The judge noticed the new arrival and the reactions he generated. Is there something else, Dr. Wright? He asked, now clearly eager to conclude the matter. No, Your Honor, Eleanor replied calmly. I believe we've addressed both issues satisfactorily. As she gathered her papers, she noticed Marcus, the law clerk who had recognized her, giving her a subtle thumbs up from the side of the courtroom. Eleanor nodded slightly in acknowledgement. The young man's intervention had helped create this teaching moment, one that Judge Harmon wouldn't soon forget. And judging by the dean's presence and the reporter's interest, she suspected this wouldn't be the last Judge Harmon would hear of today's proceedings. Judge Harmon brought his gavel down with noticeable restraint. Case dismissed. Next matter, please. Eleanor gathered her documents with unhurried precision, tucking them neatly into her leather portfolio. As she turned to leave, Dean Mitchell rose from his seat and approached her. Eleanor, he said warmly, embracing her briefly. When Professor Garcia texted me what was happening, I had to come see for myself. The judge, who had been pretending to review papers for the next case, looked up sharply at this exchange. His expression betrayed growing concern as he realized the potential consequences of his actions were expanding. Robert, Eleanor replied with a smile. You didn't need to come down here for a simple traffic matter. Simple? The dean chuckled. From what I hear, you just gave a master class in judicial accountability. Their conversation, though quiet, carried in the now hushed courtroom. Several people, including attorneys waiting for their cases, had lingered to watch the aftermath of the unusual proceeding. The court reporter approached them tentatively. Dr. Wright, I'm Melissa Johnson from the City Tribune. Would you have a few minutes to discuss what happened here today? Before Eleanor could respond, Judge Harmon cleared his throat loudly. If you're conducting interviews, please do so outside my courtroom. The reporter nodded, but didn't move away immediately. Judge Harmon, I'd like to get your perspective as well. Would you be available for comment after today's session? The judge's face tightened. The court does not comment on specific cases. All proceedings are a matter of public record. Dean Mitchell placed a gentle hand on Eleanor's shoulder. Perhaps we should continue this conversation outside, as the judge suggests. As they moved toward the exit, the bailiff stepped forward. Dr. Wright, he said quietly, my daughter is considering law school. The way you handled yourself today, well, she could use a role model like you. Eleanor smiled warmly. Have her email me at the university. I'm always happy to speak with prospective students. In the hallway outside the courtroom, a small crowd had gathered. Word had spread quickly through the courthouse about the elderly black woman who had stood her ground against Judge Harmon. Several court employees found reasons to walk by, glancing curiously at Eleanor and the dean. The reporter followed them out. Dr. Wright, many people in the legal community have stories about Judge Harmon's behavior. Your experience today seems to follow a pattern. Would you be willing to comment on that? Eleanor considered the question carefully. She was well aware of her position and influence, and knew that her words carried weight. I believe in the integrity of our judicial system, she said finally, and I believe in accountability. Today's incident was unfortunate, but it highlights something I tell my students regularly. Justice is not automatic. Sometimes it requires people to stand firm in their knowledge of the law and their rights under it. Dean Mitchell nodded approvingly. Dr. Wright's Ethics in Judicial Practice textbook is required reading for judges in several states. Perhaps it should be here as well, the reporter wrote rapidly in her notebook. And the contempt fine? $10,000 seems excessive for a traffic court proceeding. I would say that question answers itself, Eleanor replied diplomatically. As they spoke, Marcus Jenkins, the young law clerk who had recognized Eleanor in court, approached cautiously. Dr. Wright, I don't know if you remember me. I attended your guest lecture on constitutional ethics last year at Georgetown. Eleanor's face brightened with recognition. Mr. Jenkins, of course I remember. Your question about impartial application of the law was quite insightful. The young man beamed at being remembered. I wanted to thank you. It was my note to the bailiff that informed the judge who you are. Then I owe you my thanks, Eleanor said warmly, though I suspect Judge Harmon might not share that sentiment. As if summoned by his name, the courtroom door opened and Judge Harmon himself emerged. Seeing the group gathered in the hallway, he hesitated, clearly contemplating whether to turn around. After a moment's deliberation, he straightened his robes and approached them. The hallway fell silent as everyone watched, wondering what would happen next in this unexpected courthouse drama. Judge Harmon approached the group with forced confidence, his judicial robe swishing around his ankles. The conversation stopped as he drew near. Court employees pretended to be busy with papers while watching from the corners of their eyes. Dr. Wright, he said, his voice pitched low enough that only those nearby could hear. I wanted to personally express my regrets about our misunderstanding in court today. Eleanor regarded him with calm, intelligent eyes. She had faced enough insincere apologies in her career to recognize one immediately. Was it a misunderstanding, Judge Harmon? She asked quietly. Or was it something else? The judge's smile faltered. He glanced nervously at Dean Mitchell and the reporter, who was not even pretending not to listen. These things happen in a busy courtroom, he said, his tone suggesting he wanted to dismiss the entire incident. Split-second decisions, high-pressure environment. I'm sure you understand. I understand a great deal about courtroom dynamics, Eleanor replied. I've been teaching them for 35 years. Before the judge could respond, the elevator doors at the end of the hallway opened. A tall black woman in her 40s stepped out, looking around purposefully until she spotted their group. She strode toward them with confidence. Mother, she called out. Are you all right? Professor Garcia texted me about what happened. Eleanor smiled warmly. I'm perfectly fine, Janelle. You didn't need to come. Judge Harmon looked between the two women with growing unease. Judge Harmon, Eleanor said, allow me to introduce my daughter, Janelle Wright Peterson, Chief Ethics Counsel for the State Bar Association. The color drained from the judge's face. The State Bar Association had direct oversight of judicial conduct complaints. Ms. Wright Peterson, he said, extending his hand stiffly. A pleasure. Janelle took his hand briefly, her expression professional but cool. Judge Harmon, I've heard your name come up in several contexts at the Bar Association. The judge swallowed visibly. All good things, I hope. Janelle's silence spoke volumes. The court reporter, unable to contain herself, stepped forward. Ms. Wright Peterson, would you care to comment on what happened to your mother in court today? I'm not familiar with all the details, Janelle replied carefully, but I believe in the importance of judicial temperament and impartiality. The courtroom should be a place where everyone is treated with equal dignity and respect, regardless of appearance, age, or race. Judge Harmon's face tightened. If you'll excuse me, I have a docket to clear. As he turned to leave, Marcus Jenkins, the young law clerk, stepped forward unexpectedly. Judge Harmon, he said, his voice slightly shaky but determined. I submitted an ethics complaint about today's proceedings to the court administrator. The hallway went silent. Even the distant sounds of courthouse business seemed to fade away. Judge Harmon froze, then slowly turned back. You did what? Marcus stood straighter. As a court employee and member of the bar, I'm obligated to report what I believe to be judicial misconduct. The excessive contempt fine and the disrespectful treatment I witnessed today fell into that category. You're an at-will employee, Jenkins, Judge Harmon said coldly. Remember that. Dean Mitchell stepped forward immediately. That sounded remarkably like a threat, Judge Harmon. Mr. Jenkins, if you find your position here becomes uncomfortable, Georgetown law is always looking for bright young attorneys with strong ethical principles. The reporter was writing so quickly her pen could barely keep up. Eleanor watched this exchange with a mixture of pride and sadness. The system was working as it should, young lawyers standing up for what was right, accountability mechanisms engaging, but the fact that such incidents still occurred in 2025 was disheartening. Mother, Janelle said quietly, your faculty meeting starts in an hour. We should probably go. Eleanor nodded and addressed those gathered. Thank you all for your concern. I appreciate it deeply. As they walked toward the elevator, leaving Judge Harmon standing stiffly in the hallway, the courthouse buzz resumed, louder now, filled with whispers and speculation about what would happen next. No one doubted that something would. The faculty lounge at Georgetown Law School buzzed with conversation 3 days after the courthouse incident. Eleanor sat at the center table, surrounded by colleagues who had heard various versions of what happened. The City Tribune's front-page article, RESPECTED Law Professor Faces Judicial OVRRDH, lay open on the table. The reporter did a surprisingly good job, remarked Professor Diane Goldman, tapping the newspaper. She captured the essence of what happened without sensationalizing it. Eleanor nodded, sipping her tea. She asked thoughtful questions. I appreciated that she included the historical context of judicial bias. Professor James Chen leaned forward. The online version has gone viral, Eleanor. My students can't stop talking about it. Several of them were in your constitutional ethics class last semester. I never intended to become a viral sensation at my age, Eleanor said with a small smile. The door to the faculty lounge opened, and Dean Mitchell entered with a serious expression. The room quieted immediately. Eleanor, he said, Judge Harmon's office called. He's requesting a meeting with you. Murmurs rippled through the room. Professor Goldman raised her eyebrows. The nerve of that man. Did he say why? Eleanor asked calmly. His clerk said he wants to discuss the unfortunate misunderstanding and find a mutually beneficial resolution. The dean made no effort to hide his skepticism. Eleanor considered this for a moment. What do you think his real motivation is? Dean Mitchell sat down beside her. The chief judge called me this morning. The ethics complaint is gaining traction. 3 other complaints against Judge Harmon have been filed since your incident hit the news, all from minority women who appeared in his court. I suspected as much, Eleanor said quietly. There's more, the dean continued. The Judicial Conduct Committee is meeting next week. Your name came up as a potential expert witness. Professor Chen whistled softly. No wonder he wants to meet. He's trying to make this go away. Eleanor folded her hands thoughtfully. Throughout her career, she had believed in accountability, but also in redemption. The justice system needed both. I'll meet with him, she decided. But not alone, and not at his office. My office? Dean Mitchell offered. Neutral ground, with witnesses. Eleanor nodded. That would be appropriate. Please have his clerk schedule it for tomorrow afternoon. The next day, Eleanor arrived at the dean's office 15 minutes early. She wore a simple but elegant navy suit, the same one she'd worn when testifying before the Supreme Court years earlier. Janelle arrived shortly after, followed by Marcus Jenkins, who had taken a personal day from the courthouse. Are you sure you want me here, Dr. Wright? Marcus asked nervously. He already looks at me differently at work. Eleanor placed a reassuring hand on his arm. Your presence is important, Marcus. This isn't just about one incident. It's about creating lasting change. At precisely 2:00 p.m., Judge Harmon arrived, accompanied by his own attorney, a sign that he understood the seriousness of the situation. Gone was the arrogance he had displayed in court. Today, his manner was subdued, almost contrite. Dean Mitchell welcomed them formally and invited everyone to sit at the conference table. The large windows offered a view of the law school campus, where students moved between classes, unaware of the significant meeting taking place. "Thank you for agreeing to this meeting, Dr. Wright," Judge Harmon began. "I wanted to personally express my deepest apologies for what occurred in my courtroom." Eleanor studied him carefully. "I appreciate that, Judge Harmon. But I'm curious, what exactly are you apologizing for?" The question hung in the air. It was the difference between a genuine acknowledgement and a strategic retreat. Everyone in the room knew it. Judge Harmon shifted uncomfortably. This was the moment of truth, both for him personally and for the system he represented. His response would determine not just the outcome of the ethics complaint, but whether any real change would come from Eleanor's courtroom experience. Judge Harmon looked down at his hands, then back up at Eleanor. The silence stretched uncomfortably as everyone waited for his answer. "I'm apologizing for," he paused, glancing at his attorney who gave him a small nod, "for failing to treat you with the respect that every person deserves in my courtroom, regardless of who they are or what credentials they hold." Eleanor's expression remained neutral, and the judge shifted in his seat, "and for imposing an excessive and inappropriate contempt fine that was clearly disproportionate to the situation." "Is that all?" Eleanor asked quietly. Judge Harmon's jaw tightened. This wasn't going as he had hoped. He had expected to deliver his prepared apology, have it accepted, and move on with minimal damage to his career. His attorney leaned over and whispered something in his ear. The judge nodded reluctantly. "Dr. Wright," he continued, his voice strained, "I also need to acknowledge that my treatment of you reflected certain assumptions I made based on your appearance. As an older black woman, you were not afforded the same presumption of knowledge and authority that I might have given others. That was wrong of me." The room remained silent. Even Dean Mitchell, known for filling awkward pauses, let the weight of the judge's admission hang in the air. "Thank you for that honesty, Judge Harmon," Eleanor finally said. "It couldn't have been easy." Janelle spoke up for the first time. "My mother has been gracious, Judge Harmon, but I'm curious what actions you plan to take beyond this apology." The judge looked startled. "Actions?" "Yes," Janelle continued. "Apologies are important, but they don't create systemic change." Marcus Jenkins, who had been quiet until now, leaned forward. "3 other complaints have been filed since Dr. Wright's incident, all from minority women. This suggests a pattern, not an isolated incident." Judge Harmon's face flushed. "I'm not here to be put on trial by a law clerk." "No," Eleanor said firmly. "You're here because you recognize that your behavior was inappropriate and potentially damaging to your career. But more importantly, it was damaging to the public's trust in our judicial system." She stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the campus before turning back to face the room. "I've spent my career teaching future lawyers and judges about ethics and fairness. Do you know what I tell them on the first day of class, Judge Harmon?" He shook his head. "I tell them that justice is not just about following the letter of the law. It's about creating a system where everyone, regardless of their race, age, gender, or appearance, walks into a courtroom feeling that they will be treated fairly." Dean Mitchell nodded in agreement. "The question now is what happens next." Judge Harmon's attorney spoke up. "My client is hoping that Dr. Wright might consider withdrawing her support for the ethics complaint, given this sincere apology." Eleanor returned to her seat. "I didn't file the complaint, Mr. Jenkins did. And even if I could withdraw it, I wouldn't. Not without meaningful change." The judge looked defeated. "What do you want from me, Dr. Wright?" Eleanor leaned forward, her expression softening slightly. "I want you to do better, Judge Harmon. Not just with me, but with everyone who enters your courtroom." "How?" he asked, and for the first time, he seemed genuinely interested in the answer. "For starters," Eleanor said, "I'd like you to attend the Judicial Bias Training Program our law school offers. It's a 6-week course that many judges have found valuable." She glanced at Dean Mitchell, who nodded his approval. "And," she continued, "I'd like you to mentor law students from diverse backgrounds. Help them see that there's a place for them in our justice system." Judge Harmon looked surprised. "You're not asking for my resignation?" "No," Eleanor said simply. "I'm asking for your transformation." The atmosphere in the room shifted perceptibly. What had begun as a tense confrontation was becoming something else, something that held the possibility of real change. 6 months later, Eleanor stood at the podium in Georgetown Law's largest lecture hall. The room was filled beyond capacity, with students sitting in the aisles and standing along the walls. At the back, several distinguished visitors had quietly slipped in, including Dean Mitchell and, surprisingly, Judge Richard Harmon. "Today concludes our semester on ethics in judicial practice," Eleanor announced to her students. "And as promised, we have a special guest who will share some personal insights." She gestured toward the back of the room. "Judge Richard Harmon has graciously agreed to speak about his experiences with our judicial bias training program." Whispers rippled through the classroom as Judge Harmon made his way to the front. Many students recognized him from the now famous news story that had become required reading in their ethics curriculum. The judge looked different than he had 6 months ago. The arrogance that once defined his demeanor had been replaced by something more thoughtful. He approached the podium as Eleanor stepped aside. "Thank you, Dr. Wright," he began, his voice carrying clearly through the room. "When I first met Dr. Wright, it was under circumstances I'm not proud of. I made assumptions based on her appearance that were not only wrong but revealed biases I didn't want to acknowledge." He paused, looking out at the sea of future lawyers. "I've been a judge for 17 years. I thought I understood fairness and justice, but it took a parking ticket and an extraordinary professor to show me how much I still had to learn." In the audience, Marcus Jenkins sat alongside Janelle Wright-Peterson. Both had become regular guest speakers in Eleanor's class, sharing their perspectives on that pivotal day in court. "The judicial bias training program wasn't easy," Judge Harmon continued. "It forced me to examine decisions I've made throughout my career. How many times had I given harsher sentences to certain defendants? How many times had I dismissed arguments because of who was making them, rather than their merit?" Eleanor watched him with quiet satisfaction. The training program had been challenging, but Judge Harmon had approached it with unexpected commitment. "Last month," the judge said, "the Judicial Conduct Committee concluded its review of my conduct. Instead of sanctions, they'd asked me to help implement bias training for all judges in our district." Applause rippled through the room. Eleanor smiled, remembering her testimony before the committee where she had suggested this very outcome. "But perhaps the most meaningful change," Judge Harmon continued, "has come from the mentoring program Dr. Wright suggested. Working with law students from backgrounds different from my own has been enlightening." He gestured to a young woman in the front row. "Miss Patel will be clerking in my courtroom this summer, and I look forward to learning as much from her as she might learn from me." As Judge Harmon concluded his remarks, Eleanor returned to the podium. The respect between them was evident, not the forced deference he had shown in the dean's office months ago, but genuine professional respect that had grown through their work together. "Thank you, Judge Harmon," she said. "Your willingness to grow from that experience demonstrates the very best qualities we hope to see in our judiciary." After class, Eleanor gathered her materials as students filed out, many stopping to thank Judge Harmon for his candor. Dean Mitchell approached her with a broad smile. "You've done something remarkable here, Eleanor," he said. "This story could have ended very differently." Eleanor shook her head. "I just happened to be the right person in the wrong courtroom that day. The credit belongs to people like Marcus who had the courage to speak up." As they walked together toward the faculty offices, Judge Harmon fell into step beside them. "Dr. Wright," he said, "I've been thinking about that day in court. You could have immediately identified yourself as a law professor. Why didn't you?" Eleanor smiled thoughtfully. "Because in a truly just system, it shouldn't matter. The elderly black woman in simple clothes deserves the same respect as the law professor, the celebrity, or the wealthy businessman. That's what I've spent my career teaching." The judge nodded slowly. "That's the lesson I needed to learn." As they parted ways in the hallway, Eleanor watched Judge Harmon walk toward a group of waiting students. The story that had begun with arrogance and dismissal had transformed into something much more powerful, a lesson in justice that would ripple through the lives of everyone it touched.